This talk is entitled "The River Does Not End at Its Banks: Riparian Zones and Catchments as Functional Landscapes." Um, so, this part of the talk, well, the first time I started to understand that the river is not only the water that runs through it was during my bachelor thesis. In my country, we have a 1 year project to do, so it's not 3 months as you have here. So it was actually it's a 5 year degree, and then we have a whole year for doing research at the end. And there, what I did was basically traveling through the dry forest. So this little spot here in the Holdridge Triangle that I showed you before. So it's a place in the tropics that has low annual precipitation and high temperature. So it's a really specific part of the world, and it's highly threatened because it happens to be one of the best places to have cows. So there's a lot of cattle in there and a lot of agricultural expansion. So it's really threatened. And what I did in those days was trying to understand how the longitudinal patterns in the stream structure were affecting the stream fish species composition and community structure. And I did that in a multi-level approach. So I started working from the landscape. So that's why I mean landscape ecology has been a kind of a threat in what I've been doing for a while. So I took several reaches in a dry forest, and then I took a buffer around each one of the points I was going to sample fish, and I managed to assess all the land cover that was around that. So in green is the forest, so the riparian forest that we're gonna talk about later. Then I had the agriculture lands on it, urban impervious area that we talked when we were talking about the the urban stress syndrome, the percentage of agriculture, ranching, the distance of each point to the ocean, and many other landscape variables. And then I started working in a smaller scale, to the rich scale that we're talking about only hundreds of meters. And then I assess all the geometric and geomorphological variables, and also the physicochemical variables of the water, as conductivity, dissolved with oxygen, and whatnot. And then I perform a sampling in all of the stream reach to assess the fish biodiversity. And basically at the end, what I did was to relate all of these physical variables with the fish biodiversity composition. And basically one of the key results of it was that it was not the water quality the highest driver of one might think, but was more the landscape variables that were driving the species composition in this system. And basically it was more the impervious area, so the area of human intervention in each one of these buffers, which was one of the key drivers, together with the variation in salinity, which is also related to urban settlements, as we were talking before, that mediated the species-specific life history of all of these fish. So that was my first approach to river ecology and stream ecology, where I start building my research and my path here. So we talk here from channels to landscapes. So basically what we're seeing in this map over here from a study in Poland is how a single catchment has evolved in terms of land use since the 70s to 2016. And what we're seeing is the loss of natural cover, or the different, I'm sorry, not the loss of natural cover, but the change of land use. But what is most important is the urban expansion. What we're seeing here in the little black dots are houses, and in the gray areas are impervious soil or impervious surfaces. And what we're seeing is basically that from the 70s to the 2019, the entire stream catchment area is now within the city boundaries. So the whole stream started to be encapsulated by urban intervention in 2016. And so this is something that we need to take to consider when we see a river, not only seeing on the water, but seeing at it embed in its landscape. And that the river and all the variables that are inside the water, or the river, is an integrator of its landscape. So water, sediment, nutrients, and organisms move across the boundaries of the 4 dimensions of the river. And the river function cannot be understood by studying the channel alone. Basically, that's the message from this slide. And then the landscape of a catchment, there is a really key variable in the landscape of a catchment that defines it, which is the riparian zone. What is the riparian zone? Basically, in the earlier definitions from Nyman, which is one of the fathers of all the riparian studies, he basically said this: riparian zones are ecotones between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that are characterized by gradients in biophysical conditions, ecological process, and biotic communities. So this is a bit obscure. So let's look at it with this educational graph, which is showing us an ecotone. So it's an ecotone is a transitional ecosystem. We have here an aquatic ecosystem, and we have a land or terrestrial ecosystem. So ecosystem 1 and ecosystem 2. And in the intersection of it, there's an ecotone, which is a transitional region between 2 adjacent ecosystems that contains some of the species and characteristics of each one, and also contains a species of its own. So basically, it's a system that has both characteristics of the transitional ecosystem, and when this happens, then it has particular species that only live in the ecotone, but although also collects species from the two ecosystems, making it sometimes richer in terms of biological diversity and physical diversity. And then what we know is that the riparian zone is an ecotone between the terrestrial and the aquatic zone. And it's also defined physically or geomorphologically this way. We have the stream channel, then we have the floodway, which is the area where the river flows when there's a high flood season. And then we have the 100-year floodplain. What it means, a 100-year floodplain, is the area where once in 100 years there's a flood that has the probability to happen only once in 100 years. So a massive flood. So that's the outer part of the floodplain. And usually buildings and any type of human construction should be done outside the 100-year floodplain to be safe. Did you remember in Germany there was a huge event of floodings not long ago, and basically all of the homes there that were affected were built in the floodway. They were not outside the 100-year flood plain. So that basically explains one of the reasons of that event. And in the floodplain, in this entire 100-year floodplain area, is where normally we find the riparian buffer and riparian forest. All right. So as I was telling you, it's in a transitional ecosystem between land and freshwater. It is defined primarily by the hydrological influence. So it is driven mostly by water, and I will show you more in the graph. And also expands and contracts with flow conditions. So this is really important. It's a dynamic system. It's not like you can say, okay, this is the riparian forest. I'm gonna put a stick here and one here, and that's it. No, it changes throughout the year and throughout the seasons, and with the amounts of water we have. So I found some review paper which has some really funny looking figures like made in paint or something, but they're still really good for explaining things. So we have the river channel, and then we have the subsurface flow of water. So there's rain, it comes into the land and infiltrates and reach the water table, where is there is a complete filling of water, and then the water table gets smaller, gets closer to the surface, the closer that we are to the river channel. So basically the riparian zone is that area where the water table is closer to the land, and when we go further from it, we have an increasing depth of the water table, so it's harder to reach the water table. We have a decreasing soil moisture and a decreasing influence of river water. And what this means is that many times the plants that we have in this area are specifically adapted for this kind of moist soil conditions. And also, as I was telling you before, it's an ecotone that encapsulates both species adapted to moist soil and to dry soil. Sometimes we have a biodiversity rich zone, and well, that's basically what we can get from that graph. Now, in terms of the relation of the riparian zone and river health, we see a lot of how I call this? There's a lot of benefits that the riparian zone brings to the river. Basically, they regulate the river temperature. How do they regulate the river temperature? They provide shade to some of the reaches, so they don't allow direct sun energy to reach the river in some of the reaches. They stabilize the river bank. This is really important because when you remove the forest or the vegetation from the river bank, the water energy erodes the bank and creates an increase of sediments, which it has detrimental effects in the water column. What effect could have an increase of sediments in the water, like a detrimental effect, so a not good effect? If you increase sedimentation in a system that is not normally accustomed to sedimentation, what happens? How do you see when there's more sediment in water? What physical variable do you see?
Turbid.
Turbid. What turbid water means for organisms that live there? No light is a really important one. So it affects primary productivity in a river because you have high turbidity, so there's less light penetration, so there's less productivity. That's a key one. And also it increases nutrients, and maybe in a way that it can be also changing the stability of the system. Also improves river quality, river water quality. How come? All the riparian zone one of the key effects that it has in the water column on the channel is that it works as a natural filter from the water that scours through the catchment. So it traps sediments, it traps pollutants and nutrients, either natural or that are coming from human intervention. It keeps them in the system, so it retains them, so it increases the retention time. And it sometimes even plants can absorb some of these pollutants, which is called phytoremediation, or it can be broken down by the organisms in the soil, and the water quality increases highly when it reaches the water channel. Other important thing from the riparian zone is that also helps for the groundwater recharge. We were seeing in one of the lectures when they were showing us in the video where the guy was putting some water on the sponge and changing how the flood pulses were changing in the system. That's basically the effect that the riparian zone has for the river. So if there's excess precipitation, it gets trapped in the water, in the riparian zone, in the trees and plants, and is released slowly to the water channel. So changing the water pulses in it. All right. So those are some of the benefits that the riparian zone brings to rivers. So the first definitions of the riparian forest were only or mostly focusing on the riparian forest as a passive filter. So people were just looking at the forest, the riparian forest or zone, something that retains pollutants, retains water and releases, and people were not considering many of the interactions that this could have. So the first approaches to management were simply, okay, let's put a lot of plants around the rivers and that will be fine. And doesn't matter what plant. It can be a nice plant, maybe some flowers or something like that. But they were not also considering that it's not only the plants that are there, but also the type of plants, the quality, the biodiversity of plants that you have, and also the connectivity of the plants to the system. Because in many cities what we have is they put concrete in the entire channel, but they still put some plants above. So yeah, well, there's surface filtering of some sediments and things like that reach the channel, but the riparian zone is not connected only through the surface, but it's highly interactive with the water table and the hyporheic zone, so the fourth dimension of the rivers. And the other thing is nowadays we see, or there's a view of the riparian zone as an active biogeochemical reactor, which is really important concept. So in the floodplain, normally we don't see a completely flat scenario. We sometimes see ponds and small ditches where the upland water comes and is retained longer. And when it's retained, it creates a bioreactor, basically, where microorganisms and higher temperatures and all the conditions are set for a biogeochemical reaction that breaks down organic matter and that is released back again into the channel when the flood times come. So that's an important distinction nowadays in our views of the riparian zone. So function of the riparian zone depends on processes, not only in the appearance. And that's something that we see in this graph, for example, because there's also a push of a lot of cities and management authorities that say, okay, if we're gonna need to fix the rivers and put plants around them, why don't we put something that we can harvest later? So let's put pine trees, let's put eucalyptus. And then we fix two things. We have money out of the plants, and then we fix the river. But that has been shown to be not working as efficiently as doing a proper restoration of a riparian zone with the native plants and with a diverse forest or crop. So that's key. So the function depends on the processes that the riparian ecosystem gives, not only in the looks of it or appearance.
Dieses Weihnachten sind sie wieder für euch im Einsatz. Allzeit bereit in der Weihnachtszeit. Geben Sie...
Okay. So, that in terms of structure and the biogeochemical qualities of the riparian zone. Here we're gonna see just like a 2-minute clip of something that for me it was really intriguing when I first saw it. That it was the interaction of the large rivers with the flooding forest, so the riparian forest, and how these interactions are not only in terms of these biogeochemical processes, but also in the transfer of energy of the terrestrial ecosystem to the aquatic ecosystem through the organisms that live in it. And we're gonna see a nice example of that.
At more than 3 feet long, the arowana is smaller than the pirarucu, but no less frightening. The flood brings it closer to the treetops and its prey. Floods are a time of plenty for the arowanas. For months, they have access to the trees. But all good things must come to an end. The waters begin to recede. This is a dangerous time for the fish of the forest. It is all too easy to be trapped in pools and puddles, left stranded on the forest floor.
Right. Yes. So, well, the Amazon is one example, but it's not the only example of seasonal flooding and the connection of forest and the interaction of the food chain and the exchange of organic matter between these systems. But it's a crucial example, and basically what we were seeing in that aspect is how the energy coming from the riparian zone in form of insects. It could be also fruits. For example, this fish is a frugivorous fish that specifically eats only the seeds and the fruits that come from the trees during the flooding season, and it's actually one of the key dispersers of the seeds in the forest. So imagine that. So as a forest that is depending on a fish to complete their life cycle. So it's a quite particular system. So the surface flooding connects rivers to riparian soils, which is also really important. Not only the energy coming from the treetops, but also when the river floods, it brings down with it and all the energy that is in the soil from the forest. So all the organic matter coming from the leaves, trees, branches that has been breaking down during the dry season, and it brings it together with it, and sometimes it's trapped in pools like this, which are basically a bioreactor, which is the process I was telling you before, that breaks has a high efficiency of microorganism breakdown of organic matter during this transitional time between the wet and dry season. And when it completely resets, it brings together with it a high energy load to the main channel. So that brings us to the seasonal and event-driven connectivity, which dominates the function of the riparian zone. So it's not a constant function, but it's also highly seasonal, and the events that happen during the year are really important. Sometimes when we see the complete budget of energy, if we see it annually, we can see that if we see an average, it's really striking that sometimes one event of flooding can be as important for the entire average as the rest of the days. So like 2 or 3 days can drive the entire energy budget of a river. Okay. So it doesn't matter if we have a nice forest, a working forest, a riparian buffer that works perfectly and looks nice, if it is disconnected from the water channel. And how it can be disconnected? With many of the human intervention and constructions and alterations to it, as agricultural activities, urbanization, as we have seen, river flow alteration, then we're talking about dams. So basically we have a beautiful forest, but then we don't have the flood intensity and duration as it normally has. So it doesn't have the natural flow regime that we have also discussed. Overexploitation of the forest, of course. Climate change can also bring a lot of changes, basically altering the flow, pollution, and biological invasions. So that's a key event, a key driver of the change of riparian forests. There are several weeds, so plants that are invasive, and some of them in Europe that are really successful in invading the riparian buffers. And basically we change from a diverse European natural forest to a monoculture of a wheat, for example, a nutwheat, and that has the effects that we were discussing in the first graphs of lower ecosystem and functional ecosystem function. And the hydrology and residence times control the outcomes of the riparian zone interactions. Basically, what I was telling you with the natural flow regime and how long water stays in the riparian zone, so it can actually filter and generate the biogeochemical processes of the breakdown of matter to bring energy to the system. So in the last half of the section, the lecture, what we're gonna talk is about 3 specific studies. So we're gonna see 3 papers that treat these topics. We are gonna start first with a really interesting one, which are what happens with buried and piped streams. So completely disconnected laterally and vertically from the riparian zone. So what happens in one of these rivers? Then we're gonna see riparian corridors with seasonal connectivity and how that affects biodiversity, or how that works conceptually. And then finally we're gonna see the floodplains with full lateral exchange. So normal working rivers, but in the context of pollution. So what happens with wastewater treatment plant effluents and the concentration and the dynamics of pollutants in those systems. So let's start with the first case study, basically extreme disconnection, And this paper published in Biogeochemistry treats about the ecosystem metabolism and nutrient uptake in an urban piped headwater stream. So what did they do? Or what is the reasoning behind it? So when we don't think much about it because we don't see them, but stream piping is a really common feature or in urban landscapes. So wherever we are walking, we might not know it, but below us there's a stream going running there. It's basically taken all the water and it put it in a concrete box or a metal box, plastic, and it runs through the cities. And this basically is to control the discharge and not having it running through houses. It has many reasons to do it: flood discharge, stormwater treatment. So there are reasons to do them, but this creates a complete disconnection to the lateral and vertical components of the river. There's only one type of connectivity, which is longitudinal. So basically, the water is coming from upstream and it's running here, but then it loses a lot of its natural processes. And that's why the headwaters in these rivers disproportionately influence the downstream systems. So all the energy and processes are only happening in the headwaters of the river where there is connectivity. And this represents an extreme loss of riparian and floodplain connectivity. So what did they do in the study? Basically, they took one river that has this particular setting where you have an open upstream area with not normal connectivity, and you have sections that are piped. Section 1 is piped in concrete, then it opens again. Then there's other piping, but there's a long pipe 2, which is a corrugated metal piping. So you have the same river with different sections of buried or piped reaches. And they perform a seasonal comparison to capture this variability. And what they measured was the ecosystem metabolism and nutrient uptake in the sampling sites, in the piped areas and the downstream and upstream. Well, so let's do a thought exercise. What do you think will happen with metabolism and nutrient uptake in the piped areas? What comes to mind? Let's think. What is taken out of a normal connected river when you pipe it and you make it run under a city? Yeah.
So first of all, there's no nutrient exchange of the soil anymore.
Nutrient exchange, yes.
Also, when we discussed also minutes ago, there's no light this time again. So the primary production is probably turned down in these pipe regions.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other? Well, those are two really good hypotheses. Let's see what happens then. Autotrophy collapses in pipe reaches. Autotrophy, then basically primary production, as you were saying. It completely collapsed in the piped areas. So basically, this study, as many things are done in science, can sound like, okay, that sounds like it's logical and it will happen. But basically, before this study, no one actually measured, and there was no concrete numbers about these things. And here we see this is the open river in spring, and then we have the piped systems here, here, and here, and this is the open river in the summer. And this is the global primary production, which is almost absent for the piped systems. So we have a clear light limitation, which is the dominant control for the global primary production, and basically we have a loss of internal energy production, because this primary production is basically the fuel for the system in a specific reach of the river. Basically, that's the starter of the food chain in a system. And now, in the piped rivers, is depending solely from the headwaters production. With that, we have the opposite behavior with the heterotrophy, because we have ecosystem respiration that remains measurable, but that is not so intuitive. So there are functions that are happening in a piped river. There is respiration. So there is a process that is going on there. And what or where do you think that comes from? The respiration. Respiration is a measurement of basically energy breakdown by organisms in a system. What organisms do you imagine living in a completely dark piped river? I guess. Okay, so that it's important. That's something I forgot to say. But the thing is, another big change that piped streams have is that the substrate, as it's completely smooth, the velocity or the speed of the water is so high when it passes that it doesn't allow enough retention, or there's no enough material to create little places for organisms to live. So what we have here, and where this respiration is coming from, is from biofilm. So it's basically a layer of microorganisms embedded in a kind of mucus, and they can actually they adapt to different conditions, and we have specific microorganisms that can live in darker conditions and take down the energy coming from the headwaters, so dissolve in the water, and that's what we were seeing in the pipe systems. So the respiration was coming from energy from biofilm microorganisms breaking down dissolved nutrients. Here's we were. And another key thing that it was found, and is that it was a loss of biogeochemical processing capacity. So as you were saying that you imagine seeing microorganisms there, they actually found and they measure the weight of that, and they found that it's reduced in the piped rivers. Although we have some epiliton, which is basically the biofilm that grows only on rocks, we have it, but it's lower than in the open systems. But we have it, and we have the fine particulate matter that comes from plants and organisms. So basically, we have a loss of autotrophic biofilms, and we have a reduced buffering and storage capacity. So the river that runs in the piped system loses a lot of its resilience. So the resilience is the capacity of a system to bounce back after an extreme event, and this is lost in a piped system. It becomes really brittle and delicate, and it can break down easily when we have it in a piped system, and it loses a lot of these natural processes and the capacity to run the normal flux of energy. So, key lessons from this case: some ecosystems function persist. Functional diversity is strongly reduced, as we were seeing with the respiration and the primary production. And disconnected systems are fragile and have low resilience, as I was telling you. And the most important factor driving the ecological changes in the pipe reaches is the absence of light, as you were intuitively thinking at the beginning. So, and what we must consider here is that is one of the key features of urbanization is that a lot of the rivers that we have are running underground, and there has to be an effort to make changes and management to this kind of constructions. Okay. So now we go to this kind of conceptual paper that also has some empirical examples from Arias, which basically studied the interaction between flooding and upland disturbance drives and how it drives the species diversity in large river floodplains. And here's where we connect patterns of diversity and the riparian forest. So I was telling you that the riparian zone not only goes to the directly adjacent area of the water channel, it encompasses its entire floodplain. So the floodplains are laterally connected river landscapes, so they are a feature or a part of the river. The seasonal flooding expands the functional river corridor, as we were seeing in the video before. And the ecological processes extend far beyond the channel. So there's a lot of ecological processes happening in the channel, but a lot of them, or some of the most important ones, are happening actually in the floodplain or in the riparian forest. And they introduce in the paper this first figure, which is basically the global distribution of large river floodplains and the flooded forests. So flooded forests are basically forests that are maintained underwater during part of the season, and the floodplain is the entire area that only reaches or receives the 100-year floods. And well, no surprise that the biggest floodplain in the world is basically the Amazon forest, which is almost an entirely completely a riparian forest. Then we have many of the African catchments with a lot of flooded forests, and in yellow we have the rivers that they use in this paper as empirical studies. We have the Okavango in Africa, and then we have the Tonle Sap and Mekong in China and Cambodia. And the black dots are dams, which basically they are using as an example of how lateral connectivity and changes in the flood regime affects the connectivity of the riparian system. And they say basically, I took this quote out, so half of the world's large rivers that once had extensive floodplains are now regulated for hydropower, irrigation, or flood control. Something that we were seeing before in the global patterns of when we're seeing the dam lecture. So in this paper, they take two main concepts, and the author makes the effort to create a new conceptual framework to understand floodplain forests. They take the flood poles as the primary driver. So remember that seasonal pools of water that comes in the large rivers and inundates the floodplain. So the periodic flooding that controls habitat availability, but also takes into consideration the flood duration and frequency that shapes communities, and the hydrology structures, and that hydrology also structure the floodplain ecosystems. So he takes down two things: the flood gradient with the upland gradient. And he finds that in the middle of these two gradients, there's an increase of species diversity, which is basically putting together what we were seeing in the ecotone explanation, where there are two set of variables. So the water inclusion and the control from the upland variables as agriculture, flood control, and drought. And when these two variables, so there's this is what is called a. Let's go to the next. Yeah. This is the concept of the intermediate disturbance. So it's basically a concept that it entails that when an ecosystem has an intermediate level of disturbance, we have a higher biodiversity. And that's what we are seeing here. That is an intermediate level of disturbance in regards of flood or water as a disturbance, and upland gradient variables as agriculture, flood control, and drought disturbances, getting into this midpoint that will be the ecotone area, where we have higher species diversity. So flooding interacts with land use disturbance and creates this scenario where we have a higher species diversity in the midterm. The catchment conditions modify the floodplain responses. So not every floodplain responds the same way to these disturbances, and the biodiversity emerges from the interacting gradients. So this is the concept that they offer, and they actually tested with data from the field. How did they test it? Basically, the author took diversity data and the inundation periods, the inundation period in months per year in the different rivers. This data is from the Tonle Sap in Cambodia. This is diversity of plants. And what he found is that basically when you have the interaction of these two variables, so I mean, this is the exact spot they should have put the two graphs here, the flood and the upland variables, and basically that what we're seeing is the highest diversity here in the curve, where they're having the inundation period right in the middle. So where there's because basically when there's high disturbance, there's a habitat homogenization, and that happens either if you have like dry variables like droughts, or if you have floods, which basically turn the whole ecosystem into one single variable. And in intermediate conditions, we maximize the species richness. And he found similar mechanisms happening in 3 ecosystems, in the Pantanal, in the Mekong, and in the Okavango, where connectivity change the disturbance interactions in a general way, and floodplain simplification follow the regulation of the system. And the main findings of this study were basically that the floodplains act as a biodiversity and productivity engines, that the lateral connectivity is key for resilience, and the regulation and land use simplified floodplain systems. And the last thing they do is basically, because they were doing all of these biodiversity samplings physically and like taking a lot of effort to do it. And what the author says is that the future of this kind of studies linking biodiversity with hydrological patterns is remote sensing. And basically what they're showing here is how this MODIS satellite image can take the forest areas in green, and in blue it can take the water saturated areas to understand the patterns of biodiversity in a system, and how these two images are how this image allows to do a high resolution study of the land use of a catchment in this example. And so this was one of the key findings in this study. And let's go briefly with this last one just to complete. So here in this study, what they did was basically check if the riparian land use and hydrological connectivity influence was influencing the nutrient retention in tropical rivers receiving wastewater treatment plant discharge. So they took 3 different rivers and they asked the following questions. Can riparian zones reduce nutrient pollution, and is connectivity more important than vegetation alone? And they took three rivers that had a wastewater plant, and they did water quality sampling in different locations. And basically the main idea behind the study, which I took a little quote from it, which I found an interesting writing, was streams are not just the gutters down which run the ruins of continents. They can effectively process and retain materials that enter them. So it's this view of rivers or water systems just as sewages that was widely used around the world, and that has been changing constantly from those days, but still we see it in many places in developing and non-developed countries, where they serve only that function. Basically, all the water from homes and industry goes directly into the systems. But here, well, it's not the case. They do have wastewater treatment plants with different capacities and systems for pollution control. But what the authors found, and we're gonna go directly to the results, is basically that the nitrate and phosphorus was retained during high connectivity points. So they did a seasonal sampling. So they did high water sampling and dry season sampling, and what they found was a higher amount of nitrate and phosphorus being retained during the high connectivity, so the flooding season. They found that ammonium shows a variable behavior, so it doesn't change directly with the seasonality, and that riparian zones are not universal nutrient sinks. So what this means is basically that a riparian forest is not the ultimate solution. You cannot just do a forest and then you will be safe, that all the nutrients will just go there and that will be it will be absorbed by the forest. It depends of the type of vegetation they have. So the vegetation quality matters a lot. They found that the native riparian vegetation was enhancing the retention of nutrients, and the vegetation alone is insufficient without the connectivity. What they were finding is that the places that had a regulated flow, they didn't have the proper connectivity, and basically that was constraining the nutrient retention. So the structure of the forest, or the riparian forest, enables retention, but the hydrology activates the retention and the capacity of the riparian forest to absorb and process the nutrients. So the final synthesis of this lecture: rivers extend into riparian zones and floodplains. So the rivers go beyond their banks. The connectivity and connectivity, when we're talking mostly here about lateral connectivity, ridden by flooding pulses, governs ecosystem function and resilience, as we were seeing clearly in the buried rivers example and the other ones, but mostly in that one. And the effective management must be catchment scale and process based. So when we're talking about managing a river, we cannot talk about only let's have a beautiful clean strip of water running down there, but we need to see at the entire catchment, and we need to see it from the landscape perspective. And not only that it looks nice, but that it actually makes or is able to perform the processes that need to be done to maintain water quality and the functionality of an ecosystem. That's it for today.